I'm Mary Janow, Dean of the School of International and Public Affairs at Columbia University, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you to today's discussion on the domestic policy implications of the U.S. general election. This discussion follows on several events we've taken over the past week on the elections, including one on foreign policy and national security on November 6th, and one this past Monday we hosted with former White House Chiefs of Staff Josh Bolten and Secretary Jack Lew, who discussed their presidential experiences, their experiences managing presidential transitions. You can view both of these as well as this discussion later on SIPA's YouTube channel. And today we're focusing on domestic policy, which of course, in many crucial ways is going to define the Biden presidency and its first 100 days and beyond. I think we've already heard the president-elect begin to articulate his near-term domestic priorities, COVID-19 response, the economy, climate, addressing structural racism and other issues. And I'm really delighted to welcome a panel of true experts from Columbia SIPA who will help us evaluate, examine these priorities and possible approaches. Let me very briefly introduce them to not take away too much from your discussion time. Ester Fuchs is Professor of International Public Affairs and Director of the Urban and Social Policy Program at SIPA. She's also served in government as Special Advisor to the Mayor for Governance and Strategic Planning under Mayor Michael Bloomberg, and also serves as Director of who'sontheballot.org, which has been, I think, a very effective online voter engagement initiative for New York City. Christina Greer is Visiting Professor of International Public Affairs. Her research focused on race and racial and ethnic politics, American urban centers, presidential politics, campaigns and elections. She's the author of the book, Black Ethnics, Race, Immigration, and the Pursuit of the American Dream. Christine, wonderful to have you with us. Thank you. Alexander Hertel-Fernandez is Associate Professor of International Public Affairs. He's a political scientist who studies the political economy of the United States and has really done some groundbreaking work on the politics of organized interests in public policy, and is the author of the recently published book, Politics at Work. And I particularly want to acknowledge Anya Schiffrin, who is moderating today's discussion and I think organized today's discussion. She's director of the Media Technology and Communications specialization at SIPA, where she teaches on global media innovation and human rights, rights on journalism and development, investigative reporting in the global South, and has published extensively in the last decade on media in Africa, and has recently become focused on solutions to the problem of online disinformation, has written a PhD on that topic, and is editor of Global Muckraking, 100 Years of Investigative Reporting in 2014, and African Muckraking came out in 2017. And I hear there is a forthcoming Media Capers that's coming out in 2020. So congratulations, Anya, and very pleased to hand this over to you. Thank you all for organizing and this great discussion to follow.
Great, thank you so much. And to Rachel Sala from Columbia Communications, from SIPA Communications Office, Nadine Tamamli, our program assistant, Alan McInerney, for doing all the heavy lifting, and to Yasmin Ergas, who suggested that we do this event because she wanted to make sure we talk about gender. Happily, Joseph Stiglitz, my husband, is able to join us, which is lucky because I think we're going to need to talk about the economy quite a bit, since that was such a key election issue. And it was really Esther who asked me to bring along Joe. I guess I wanted to open up by just saying, you know, we've all been getting congratulations from friends and colleagues around the world on the election of Biden. But the reality is actually quite grim that non-college educated white men and women voted for Trump, that 70 million people in this country voted for a racist, incompetent grifter. And now I'm hearing from Christina that we may not even get the Senate, in which case we're going to be really stymied. So I would, love to hear from all of you panelists a little bit about what happened, but also where can we go realistically? And I thought that since, precisely as the dean pointed out, COVID-19 and the economy was such a big part of the election, I thought maybe we could just hear a little bit from Joe about sort of what you think they can actually do in terms of economics.
Well, thank you. First, let me just say one of the things I found amazing is that when they did interviews after the election and talked about why people who had voted for Trump, those who supported Trump said it was because of the economy, what he had done for the economy. And quite frankly, I found that amazing because I thought his economic policies were a disaster, and particularly for some of the people who had voted for him. So that's a mystery. And in terms of politics going forward, one of the challenges facing Biden will be to use that phrase, change the narrative to persuade people that the Democrats are better at advocating for economic advances that will be widely shared. So changing that perception is going to be very important. Now, as Anya pointed out, the ability to do that is greatly hampered by not controlling the Senate. That will limit the legislative agenda. So let me assume that happens, that nightmare scenario, but assume that happens. The question is, what can Biden do? And in many ways, Trump has shown that there are actually many instruments at the power of the president. He has done an enormous amount of damage, but we should be thankful that he wasn't particularly competent. And the Biden administration coming in with a very competent team will have the ability to, I think, more fully exploit the powers of the presidency. So let me just talk about a few of those. Obviously, in the area of international affairs, his role is dominant. So reestablishing the international rule of law, rejoining by not bombing out the WTO, blocking the appointments of appellate judges, blocking the appointment. A good friend of ours is the leading candidate for the new head of the WTO, Ngozi from Nigeria, and U.S. has blocked that, but that would likely change. And it would be a big change for the WTO to have somebody from a developing country, as they had, and somebody extraordinarily competent. The rejoining Paris would also be both symbolically and also in terms of the international agenda for moving to climate change extraordinarily important. So just more broadly, I think with the international arena, lots of the terms of lots of the broader framework within which the United States operates, and a lot of the damage that we're doing in economics is through international affairs. So that, I think, will be one of areas where he can really operate and change what is going on. The second thing that the President Trump used all the time were executive orders. And Obama used those to some extent, Trump more so. And there are lots of arenas for executive orders. Let me just give you one. It will be difficult through legislation to get an increase in the minimum wage that most Democrats, I think most Americans the vast majority of Americans want. But President Obama issued an executive order that said that anybody doing business with the government had to pay $10.80 an hour. And that could be increased to $15 an hour. And that affects a very large fraction of all business and pulls up wages throughout the economy. The same thing can be done with a lot of other work conditions that they can be imposed as a condition for government contracts. A second area, very important, is the executive orders that basically direct what the administration would be doing anyway, increasing worker protections through OSHA. And that would open up the way, I think, for some political compromises, for instance, on liability. A big thing Republicans want is immunity from liability on COVID-19 suits. And if there were a tough OSHA standard, I think the Democrats should be willing to say, if you meet those tough OSHA standards, then that should give you some protection. So that's an example where by using administrative measures, they actually can open up some legislative opportunities. There's lots of regulatory actions that the government can take, particularly in the area of climate change, reversing all the things that Trump did, but then advancing those issues even more. One area that I think needs to be explored more is changing our legal position, the administration's legal position on a number of suits. I'm an expert witness in a suit by 21 children, including one of our Columbia students, against the Trump administration for violating due process and the national interest doctrine, which says that we hold our national resources, including the environment, in fiduciary, in trust for future generations. Biden can just say, I agree with the plaintiffs, and stop challenging the suit and basically put the executive branch under monitoring by a judge to, in this case, a very friendly judge in Oregon, to make sure that the executive branch actions are in conformity with the interest of future generations. That would be important because it would make it much more difficult for the next Republican administration to reverse those kinds of protections. And finally, the Trump administration explored the use of repurposing funds in ways that were clearly contrary to what anybody in Congress intended, like the building of the wall. Well, I think that idea of repurposing funds in ways to advance his agenda, including climate change, a stronger post-pandemic recovery, with things with higher multipliers, seems to me one of the things that he could do that would be not a substitute for legislation, but at least a temporary, accomplish a little bit of what he otherwise could have done. So let me stop there. There's a lot more that could be said, but let me just stop there and hear. I'd like to hear the views of the others on the
Yeah,
panel.
great. I wasn't sure if Christina or Alex wanted to come in here. Obviously, anything to do with minimum wage and labor immediately makes me think of Alex. But Christina, I wasn't sure if you had any thoughts here or if you wanted to hang on for a minute.
No, I'll let Alex respond on the economics.
Okay, great. And then we'll ask Esther to talk about urban policy. Great. Alex, over to you.
Great. Thanks so much, Anya, and thanks so much to everyone who went into and worked on organizing this panel. It's a really privilege to participate. And I just wanted to start by reiterating how important those regulatory and administrative steps are that Professor Stiglitz laid out to boost the fortunes of the working class and really all Americans that are at Biden's disposal on day one. And the reason why I stress those as being so important is that as we're seeing from the post-election analyses that are coming out now, obviously we have to be cautious with the data that we have, but the analysis that we have so far suggests that polarization of the electorate by education has continued, with non-college educated voters continuing to move to the Republican Party. And significantly, what we saw this time is that it's not just non-college educated white voters, but also non-white voters as well. And that's significant because it places the Democratic Party at an increasing disadvantage in the Senate and in the Electoral College. And that's an important part of the reason why, despite receiving national majorities of the vote, President-elect Biden can't count on a Democratic Senate, and the Democratic majority in the House is going to be smaller than it was going into this electoral cycle. And I think in order for Democrats to have a shot at making inroads with non-college educated individuals, they're going to have to show that the party is making tangible changes to government that are felt and realized on a daily basis in these people's lives, whether that's changes to workplace safety, stronger OSHA enforcement, for instance. Notably, that agency has been really asleep at the wheel at the midst of the COVID crisis, was very slow to issue guidance and regulations, and went into the crisis with some of the lowest levels of staffing that we've seen in decades. But it also could include changes to the procurement policies of the US, as well as measures that would provide immediate economic relief. For instance, changes to educational loan policy that would relieve a certain percentage of the debt that Americans hold right now. So I think all of those changes will be really essential to the Biden administration, not just for the economic reasons that Professor Stiglitz laid out, but for political ones too, if the Democrats want to continue to have a shot at winning majorities in the states that they need in order to have control over the levers of the federal government. And just to close, I wanted to highlight this asymmetry that the two parties face now. It's increasingly apparent that Democrats will need to receive something on the order of at least 54% of the national vote in order to have a shot at controlling the levers of the federal government. That's a huge disadvantage, and it's one that in the short term they'll have to address through this kind of political organizing, and over the longer term I think will have to be addressed through political reforms. Obviously, that's not going to be possible with the current configuration of Congress, but I think it's something that should be on the agenda as we think about what will happen with the Senate in the coming years. But I'll stop there and throw it over to the other panelists now as well.
Thank you so much. Professor Greer, you've been studying politics and also race deeply for a very long time. And it really seems that it was white women, black women and black men who really kind of saved the Democrats in this election. And I was wondering what you think realistically will be given to address and done to address the structural racism in this country in light of the election victory. Do you feel that Kamala Harris is going to be able to be a force for good? And clearly there's just so much left to be done. And again, I think the reaction of so many people I know is just the shock that the margins weren't even bigger than they were.
Right. I mean, I wasn't shocked. I wasn't shocked that 70 million people said children separated from families, women being forcibly sterilized, the recession, almost 250,000 Americans dead, 10 million living with COVID, ripping apart the ACA, COVID's now a precondition, leaving the Paris Accord, taking native lands. I wasn't shocked that 70 million people said, sign me up for 4 more years of that. I'm good, right? I mean, if we know this nation is predicated, there are 4 legs of the table: white supremacy, anti-Black racism, patriarchy, and a certain type of racialized capitalism that this nation is founded and predicated on. It's not surprising that, white women voted in the majority for the Republican Party candidate. They've done so since 1952. The only 2 times they haven't, right, voted for the Republican nominee is 1964, the election of my favorite president, LBJ, and 1996, second term Clinton pre-Monica, right? But other than that, like, white women are Republicans. So much so that Black women are so big D Democratic, we pull the gender conversation where we have a whole series of scholars who talk about this gender gap where one does not exist, actually, right? Women aren't Democrats and men aren't Republicans. White people are Republicans, Black people are Democrats. So this whole conversation about, Black men and Ice Cube and all this other thing, that was a tempest in a teapot, because it's Black women who were the keepers of the Democratic Party and, dare I say, democracy. And the second largest group are Black men, percentage-wise. So everyone else is the distant third, fourth, et cetera. It's Latinos and Asian Americans. And then white people, by and large, are Republicans. And so if you look at Jane Junn's research, she's the one who wrote the great piece called Hiding in Plain Sight that explains sort of white women's behavior. So this conversation about economic anxiety is about race. It's about racism. It's about a backlash of Barack Obama and 8 years of Barack Obama. So going to your question, Anya, about Kamala, that's really interesting, because for me, even with COVID and recession, and we see people supporting the Republican Party and Donald Trump specifically and explicitly at droves, I don't think that, the president's unwillingness to concede and the Republican sycophants staying in line, it's actually not about the Democrats. I don't think it's about Joe Biden. I think it's about Kamala Harris. And if we look at what's happening right now through a racial lens, through a gendered lens, you have a Black woman, you have an Asian woman, you have a daughter of 2 immigrants, right? You have someone who has chosen not to have children. So she has agency over her body, which goes back to Roe v. Wade. It goes to the Supreme Court conversations we're having. It goes to white people's fears that, like, we have to take away abortion because only white women can make white men. So, like, all of these conversations are wrapped up in this one woman who's literally a heartbeat away from the oldest elected president in the history of the nation. And she's the decider in the Senate. So when we think about Georgia, if Georgia does go, 50-50, who's the tiebreaker? Kamala Harris. And so we know that Republicans are still apoplectic about Obama, but at least Obama was a guy. And the gender piece is really important in that conversation. And so as we zoom out to, like, what has happened and what is happening, I think that, there's never been a time in this country where Black women have gotten something before white women, except for rape. That's it, right? But other than that, so that also explains some of this reticence of women to support what is happening right now and to support Kamala Harris. And so I think when we sort of try and process the effects of coronavirus, the effects of coronavirus on the economy, the effects of coronavirus on families, right? 130 Secret Service officers are inflicted with coronavirus. That's 130 communities. We're not talking about the Black and Latinx people who work in the White House, who we know have coronavirus, and we'll never know about that. But the economic fallout of what that has meant for cities and towns across the country is something where it's just only in this country can we have all of this on the table and still pretend that, like, it's just like, it's a little awkward. It's like, no, if this man were brown, I know his tanning is a little off, but if this were any other country, we'd call it a coup. We'd call it what it was, right? As we go around the world wagging our fingers at African nations and South American nations and Asian nations. And so we're in a moment that I'm trying to explain to my students about this peaceful transference of power that I think will ultimately happen, but I'm concerned about the next 69 days and what will be excavated in the next 69 days from a grifter, someone who has always left a country or a company worse than he found it. I'm afraid that he'll sell this country for parts. I'm afraid that he'll go to the highest or lowest bidder that he can. I think he's thinking about a Black woman who holds his fate in his hand, and her name is Letitia James, the Attorney General of New York, right? Because he can't pardon himself from state crimes. So, I mean, all of these things are happening in his life that contribute to this unwillingness to concede. I don't think you'll ever concede, but this unwillingness to accept reality. We can all count. We know the magic number is 270 and we know we reached it. So these musings that are called court cases still worry me, because even though our institutions have been frayed, they haven't been broken per se. So we're still seeing courts work on lower levels, but he's also seeded the courts with 200 some odd individuals, many of whom really received an F rating from the American Bar Association. So he will find a sympathetic judge at some point. And we know that Donald Trump is famous for saying, I'll take it to the Supreme Court. That's not how the Supreme Court works. If you paid attention, you know institutions don't work that way. You can't have feelings and make it a court case. We're seeing that that's happening. They're getting thrown out. But there will be someone who upholds a court case somewhere, and it'll make its way possibly through the chain. And I think the longstanding effects, before I pause, the longstanding effects of Donald Trump will be felt long after he's gone. But in a country that does not know how to articulate what has happened in our past, centuries past, I fear that we're going to make a lot of the same mistakes. So knowing that Black women have only been in the electoral process since basically the 1965 Voting Rights Act, I think the visual when Donald Trump leaves will be Biden-Harris, the Obamas, the Clintons, and the Bushes, and it'll look like a civilized democracy. But that tearing that has happened over the past 4 years, ever since he came down that brass escalator and said Mexicans were rapists, and we just pretended like he didn't say that, right? I think that's going to be the real problem. A lot of people want to go back to normal, but normal wasn't okay even then.
Dr. Greer, if he moves to Florida, will New York not be able to prosecute him? We were just vaguely puzzling over that at dinner last night.
I don't know. I think Tish James can still, keep in mind, we've got dual crimes, right? We've got the crimes before he was in office, and we've got the crimes since he's been in office. So I'm not too sure how that works. But I'm so sure that Tish James can snag him from Florida. I know his residence is now in Florida, and maybe that's a strategic choice that he's made. But I'm also curious, it's like, what kind of lawyers will he have? Half of them have been disbarred in prison. And I think, you can only hustle people for but so long. And so now that people have kind of gotten wise to the grift, many of them might want their money up front.
Well, I was happy
that's the concern I have, because that's why he's siphoning off money now, fundraising and all this other stuff, to make sure he has money to pay for the $400 million Deutsche Bank that's coming up, that debt, all these other little debts. And then you need real lawyers, not the incompetent, as Joe mentioned previously. I think the thing that has saved us these past 4 years is the gross incompetence of so many of these individuals. We don't have to mention the Four Seasons to know that incompetence has existed long before.
Someone must have been pranking him on the Four Seasons. I was relieved to see some law firms are now facing sort of internal dissent, and people saying we can't, it's a breach of our professional ethics to support this man. So,
well, because the court cases, Esther and Dan could speak to this more clearly, but it's like, you have to have a case to go to court. Just because I feel some certain way doesn't make it a court case. That's musings. And so I think that there are lawyers who they're so deathly afraid. The weight of the presidency still matters. The problem is Donald Trump has never respected or understood that weight. So he throws it around. But there are some people who recognize, like, can I go to a court of law based on someone who says, well, I think I saw something, and also pick and choose. Do you want me to stop counting or do you want me to start counting, right? On the same ballot, Joe Biden's an illegitimate president, but Mitch McConnell isn't. So, like, what is the case, right? This is nonsense talk, right? So I think certain lawyers are saying, it's like, we've amused you for quite some time. And now, as we've seen Donald Trump, and he's done this in New York and Atlantic City and places all around, he leaves people in his wake. He leaves formerly respectable people with no reputation. He's Teflon, but they have either gone to prison, will be going to prison, right? Or their reputations have been shattered. Or Herman Cain, you're no longer with us, right? So you choose your adventure when you roll with Donald Trump. And so I think finally some folks are realizing, like, we're now in a transition stage. Joe Biden is the president-elect. The power shift is actually now moving to Mitch McConnell. It's moving away from Donald Trump. Donald Trump's not going to run in 2024. He'll be 78. He'll troll the Democrats and Republicans for 4 years. But, like, he'll figure out a grift. And, like, there's no point in being president in 2004, right? 2024. And the Republicans, if they were smart, I'm not a Republican strategist, I don't need to be, but like they would start building their bench beyond this because they've got to figure out what their brand looks like. You can't be the party of homogeneity and white nationalism. That's just, it's not a longstanding strategy. Even though young people, we saw the data, young white people did vote for Donald Trump in solid numbers, the Gen Zers. So, you know, we constantly love this conversation about, oh, the old people will die off. If that's the case, U.S. chattel slavery would have been one generation. That's not the case. Like, young people don't die off, you learn it. So he definitely has a brand that he's building, but it's not a longstanding brand, especially as we now have a blue wall. Kamala Harris is the first Democrat elected on the West Coast in our history, right? The Democrats. So it's like now we've got this blue wall on the West Coast of California, Oregon, Washington. We now have this blue ceiling we're building with Minnesota, Wisconsin, and Michigan. We've got the Northeast Blue Corridor. And then because of Stacey Abrams, we might all of a sudden start getting little blue pockets in the South. And if it weren't for gerrymandering and the way we sort of conduct our census and block out Black folks, Alabama and Mississippi, if they were restructured differently, we could actually, and then their laws were different, we could actually have a blue South. Mississippi is 40% African-American. Alabama's a distant second. So like it is possible with organizing and like restructuring certain state level rules that would actually build back the power of the Black vote. So, and we know North Carolina is up for grabs, Virginia's there. So like there is a solid path. And then, you know, the conversations about electoral college, we abolish that. Then it's like, it's Democrats all day, Republicans have no strategy, period. So all of those conversations are on the table, but as mentioned by Alexander and Joe, they have to be had in the shadow of 250,000 Americans have died. We have cases like COVID, recession. It's sort of like 2009 Redux, but just different. Joe Biden will have a very limited amount of time before the midterm election to do a lot to save America. Before we were trying to save America from falling off a financial cliff. Now we're trying to save America literally from killing itself, but also a financial cliff. Maybe not as steep, but it can be. I mean, I teach in an institution, it's not an Ivy. I'm at Fordham University. We don't have much longer of like Zoom classes where parents can and will pay for like a glorified, you know, computer class. Like it's not a sustainable strategy for universities. So like so many parts of the economy are struggling and will continue to struggle if we don't get the coronavirus under control.
That's absolutely right. Up until that last little bit, Professor, I was starting to feel more optimistic. So thank you. And I was going to say, I'd love to take your class. So inspiring.
I learned from Esther.
Well, I was going to say, Esther, this sounds like it's coming back down to sort of cities and mayors. I mean, first of all, can cities secede? Joe, you know, Joe's great at scenarios. So he has all of these scenarios where we have the big cities forming health insurance pools with each other. You know, right? We have these alliances of mayors now, progressive mayors around the world. What do you see? What role can cities and play in the coming years, and especially to address the points that Professor Greer is talking about, all the structural racism and the gerrymandering and the voter suppression?
Can you hear me? Okay, I just lost your voice, Anya. I think you just turned yourself off.
Yes, I did. You're a little bit low, Esther. Could you do some great Ester Fuchs, high altitude, you know, high
Let
velocity.
me see if I can get it up. Okay, is that better? A little bit better? I can just, is this better? Yeah?
No, that's worse.
That's worse.
This is like going to the eye doctor. We're
I'm
like, is
so
it this
sorry.
one or is it this one? Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
We know you can be loud and proud, like at a faculty meeting.
Okay, we'll work on it. Okay, so,
Okay.
you know, to follow Christina and Alex and Joe is not an, let alone to be introduced by Anya is not an easy task here. First of all, I just wanted to say thank you for including me in this. This is just a wonderful group of people and extraordinary discussion we're having right now. As some of you know, especially Christina, I tend to be kind of a structuralist in my view of things, even though I do, of course, we have to go back to human behavior and to the individual personalities, especially when it comes to the presidency. And so I'm kind of gonna start where Christina left off, really, which is, is there a way forward after a very divided election where, 70 million people, over 70 million people, voted for the wrong guy? I'll be a little more subtle than everybody else in this conversation. Clearly voted for the wrong guy. So I've been looking at the data just in terms of how we can think about the mandate from this election, because one of the things the popular vote tells us, even though it doesn't tell us who the winner is, because obviously you have to go through the Electoral College, it does tell you about what kind of a mandate a president can have. And one of the really important things about a Biden-Harris administration is nobody is going to White House searching for the men's room and the ladies' room. They have been there. They know how to get stuff done. It's an extraordinary advantage, as Joe was talking about. They will understand how to do executive orders. They will understand the regulatory state. So they will not just wait for a Republican Senate to be obstructionist and hope that maybe it isn't really happening and that it will change and that ultimately people will turn around and do the right thing. I think they will try to do those kinds of coalitions because one has to get legislation passed, but I don't see any hesitation to take the full power of the executive branch to move things forward in many of the ways that already have been, articulated by Alex and Joe and Christina. And I think part of the reason that will be successful, and I also think, believe it or not, that for the stimulus package and for the pandemic work that has to be done from a national level, there will be support from this Congress, that this problem is no longer will have a voice denying the reality of it. We're in a second wave. Everybody understands that our economic recession is linked to the failure of the federal government to deal with this pandemic. And I think that this is politically incendiary for the Republicans not to deal with it. Also, the other piece of the structural problem here, or this sometimes is an advantage, sometimes is a disadvantage, is federalism, of course, as already was alluded to by Alex in this conversation. And also Anya, in asking me sort of what can the cities do, even though we potentially will have this divided government at the national level. So it's sort of ironic. At so many points in American history, we've sort of bemoaned states' rights has always been a kind of negative thing. But over time, we're realizing that states and cities actually can do an extraordinary amount during the periods in which the federal government is not interested in doing progressive types of legislation. Having said that, I'll go back to Joe, which is if we don't get a handle on the economy, this is not going to work at all because every single city and almost every state government is in a fiscal crisis right now. And Christina and I have been talking about this. It's sort of an extraordinary moment in which, deja vu all over again, as we say. It's not 1975, but because the crisis is caused by some other factors, but there's no question that we're in for extraordinary cutbacks at the city level if we don't get the aid directly to state and local governments through the stimulus package, which is one of the things that Biden has been supporting and that, of course, Trump has been obstructing. So let me explain for a moment why I am optimistic. I want to say cautiously optimistic, but I am optimistic about some of the changes that I think will have to go forward at the city level. And I'm optimistic, I gotta, say this in the context of, the federal government has been not really very effective or very positive toward urban areas since 1979. And that was Jimmy Carter. Jimmy Carter began the period of decline in federal aid to cities. And by the way, nobody changed that, not Bill Clinton, not Obama. not the Democratic presidents, not the Republican presidents, they've all continued to reduce spending, the real dollars that go directly to states and to specifically, especially to city programs, and really, especially in the social service area and redistribution. And I, for one, without, getting into detail, feel that many of the so-called urban policy that were put into place by Bill Clinton, have been devastating for cities, which is taking social welfare out of the entitlement bucket and making it a block grant means that as poverty goes up in cities, we don't really get more money to deal with the poverty problem from the federal government, to just put a point on it. So I don't anticipate the kind of dramatic changes that we got during, the Great Society or the New Deal. And I'm with Christina. LBJ is kind of my hero too, when it comes to domestic policy, and especially as it relates to cities and to race issues in this country. And but what I do see is two very important things coming out of the electorate, and why I think the Republicans will have to engage this time around and will not be able to simply take that obstructionist approach that they did to the Obama administration. So, if we two things, if we look at the breakdown of the city, suburban, small city, rural vote, first of all, cities constituted 29, the larger cities over 50,000 constituted 29% of the electorate. Suburbs were 51%, but as we know, the inner ring suburbs behave more like cities, and that doesn't break it out. The so-called small cities in rural area are now only 19% of the electorate, okay? It's small. Now we know they have disproportionate impact because of the Electoral College, but I believe even this is going to flip in a way to some extent when it comes to national policy. Needless to say, the city voters, broke 60% for Biden. That's it, 60%. It wasn't like 90%, 60%, but it's big enough and we'll take the win. Suburban voters for the first time went Biden, 50%. And, that has to do with the change, partly the change in suburbs, which they're more multi-ethnic and multiracial than they used to be. So we're not talking about simply white suburbs. And I think Christina nailed that point so effectively when it comes to who really put this Democratic candidate over the finish line in terms of the vote. But I wouldn't underestimate this movement in terms of support for Democratic candidates, both in the inner ring suburbs as well as in cities, and the importance of this for creating determining the direction of federal policy. The other thing goes to an early point that Joe made about the relationship between COVID and the economy and what people vote on. So, those of us who are political scientists, which Joe, I think this is the first time you're outnumbered. We have 3 political scientists here to the 1 economist. So, we're playing our card very strong here. But very few things I would say political scientists get right about anything for that matter, to be honest. But in elections, one of the things that we've known for a long time is people do vote about their major impetus in their vote choice is the economy. It's not just the economy, it's their subjective perception of the economy, how it's impacting them. And what was really, really interesting for me in some of the exit poll data was this relationship between the economy and COVID and the dominant issues. So not surprisingly, the largest sector did still say the economy was the most important issue. 35% of the electorate said their primary issue that impacted their vote was the economy. But here's what's interesting. 20% said racial inequality. That never showed up in the past polls, okay? 20% actually identified racial inequality as the first issue, the primary issue. So this goes back to what Christina was saying. And then 17% said the COVID pandemic, And then another 11% said healthcare policy. So this is really, in my view, very important in terms of the mandate and what the elections may mean, because, you know, I taught parties and elections for 20 years, and I'd have to convince the students that it makes a difference if you vote, and that the parties are different, and most of the time they didn't really believe me. We know that this election has consequences, and it really does make a difference whether a Republican or a president was, or a Democrat was elected the president. And I think we see that in this data, because when we look at the second piece of this puzzle, which is more important, containing the virus, even if it hurts the economy, or rebuilding the economy now, even if it hurts efforts to contain the virus? Okay, so what we learned is that 52% of the electorate actually said containing the virus is more important, and only 42% of the electorate said building the economy was more important, okay? And then when we look at that in terms of course, where they split on the vote, going back to the first choice issues, so the people who thought that the economy was more important were more likely to be Trump voters. The people who said COVID was more important were most important, Biden. And of course, racial inequality were also Biden voters. In the aggregate, by a not very large margin, but large enough, these voters who think that, you know, we need to worry about healthcare, we need to worry about racial inequality, and we need to worry about containing the COVID virus while we're worrying about the economy, are the majority of voters right now. And while this is not a big majority, my view, and this is my sort of positive view of what's going on, they are increasing. The longer we're into the second wave, you know, while we know Trump will do as much damage as he can, you know, what was said earlier by Joe, changing the narrative, and this is very important, you know, but he won't have the same bully public, Christina. And I don't believe the Republican Party is going to hook their wagon to Trumpism. There's too many other choices out there. And as you point out, he is a cult of personality. And parties, as Alex pointed out, cannot really succeed around a cult of personality. They need their working class voters. They need their population in a democratic process, you know, if we survive until the transition, to support him. And I would say that this is gonna come to a large extent from the cities and from African-American voters. It's very clear that that is happening, and that the country, the demographics of the country are moving in that direction. What I am seeing, and I'll stop at that, around the policy transformations that will particularly be important in the cities right now, is this aid to state and local government, is you know, rescinding the tax that puts a cap on your deduction for state and city taxes, because this is terrible for the fiscal situation of cities and makes it hard for them to raise taxes without worrying that businesses and rich people will move out. So I think this is especially important. But I also think that, you know, in this regulatory state and in this executive order land that we're living in, you know, we got to deal with this anarchist jurisdiction thing that Trump decided to label cities as anarchists and withhold federal aid. It goes back to the point that was made earlier about the wall, about shifting existing revenue to other places. So I think that the cities have enormous amount at stake in this election right now. I'm going to say something that sort of it flies in the face of what I normally think. I do think cities, and I've been, you know, for years have taken this position that, you know, cities can do a lot despite what the federal and national government does. But in an economic recession, they cannot do a lot. They're in the process right now of figuring out what to cut and who to tax, basically. And if cities are in a are forced to be in that position of cutting basic services, we're going backwards. We're going backwards to 1975 and all of the economic growth that has funded redistribution at the city level, that has funded climate change policies at the city level, that has funded pro-immigration policies at the city level. We do so much at the city level that in every other advanced industrial society, every European democracy, they do at the national level. And that's because, as Anya said, got a failed state to a certain extent here. So we need to get this recession. We need to deal with the economy. This is why I was so excited, to have Joe on this panel, because I hope they're talking to you, Joe. I hope we, get some of the things that you're putting forward implemented. And I see that as a critical piece of the puzzle, obviously connected to the coronavirus.
Esther, thank you so much.
Everything.
Esther, thanks. I'm going to let Joe talk for a minute about taxes and then ask Professor Greer and Professor Hertel-Fernandez to address some of the excellent questions from our students that are coming in. What you said about spending is very germane, because Joe, of course, has been writing a little bit about the Trump, tax bill, and your observation that structurally the blue states are just giving money to the red states, and that was part of the last bill, right?
Yeah, the tax bill in December 2017 was unusual in that it really pitted the red states against the blue states. The distribution effects across the states and between the cities and the rural areas were very great. And what it did is by eliminating tax deduction or eliminating tax deduction for state and local taxes, income taxes, which are disproportionately in the progressive states on the two coasts, and then lowering temporarily individual income taxes. It had large distribution effects. And one of the consequences of that, perhaps, is that those in the red states felt that they were doing better. Their take-home pay went up. While in fact, in the blue states, for those in the middle, not the bottom, but those in the middle and upper middle, actually saw their tax rates actually increase. Large numbers saw their tax rates increase. And this is going to be, even if we had control of the Congress, changing this, reversing this is not going to be easy because undoing this negative redistribution is going to be difficult. One of the things I wrote an op-ed, two op-eds about, one of them was that the way that tax bill was designed has the effect of, on average, individual income taxes start to go up in 2021 and 2023 and 25, and then a lot in 2027. So individuals will begin, this whole thing was designed as a charade that people would see a tax cut before the election, and they wouldn't realize they're getting a tax increase after the election. The second thing is, I think the state and localities have the room for increasing progressive taxes temporarily in response to the pandemic. And I think in the absence of federal assistance, they'll have to do that, because otherwise their ability to respond to this pandemic will be too limited.
Good, that's great. Thank you for that. And then there were a couple questions from the students. I think Zaki's really interested to know, Zaki Klager, Professor Greer, what sort of particular policies you would support to address structural inequalities and racism in this country. So if we'd start with that, and then Alex, just to give you a heads up, you're being asked about more details as to how to reach out to the non-college educated white men and women that are voting for Trump. I would just add, Professor Greer, cutting ahead of you, that reparations would be one of my top things that need to be done. But I'm just the moderator.
Yeah.
I also yeah. So take it from there. You're the expert.
Yeah, and it's interesting because I think that that's a much more complicated question, right? Because I mean, as someone who wrote a book called Black Ethnics, it's like, who gets it, right? And also, do we get a whole bunch of money to put back into white systems? So what, to just give white institutions more money? So I think it has to be a really creative way of thinking about what reparations could look like, because it can't just be a check, because then all that money just goes right back to white people. So that doesn't make any sense to me. So really complicating that question. And there are some scholars that are working on that, and that's kind of not my bag. Hey, I'm like 15th generation American. It might happen, but that's, I'm not leading that charge. And I think it needs to be done, because the thing is, money with no apology or recognition what you've done is just wasted money that just goes back into the white economy. And so that's the piece that like America's not willing or ready to do. The reticence is about the money. We have the money. We can go to war tomorrow and find all the money. It's like, are you going to acknowledge what you've done? No, this country is not going to do that. We haven't. I'm not holding my breath for it. I think it's so interesting though, because Joe was talking about blue states versus red states. And what I always tell my students, I teach intro to politics every semester. And I always tell them, there's no such thing as blue states and red states. They're all red states, right? It's, do you have enough blue cities in your red state to make it blue every 4 years? And so then that goes back to Ester, because it's like, we're talking about cities and like people of color who keep getting pushed out. That's why I thought it was so fascinating when the president kept talking about the suburbs. I'm like, but Black and Latinx people are in the suburbs because we keep getting pushed out of the cities. So like, it's this never ending cycle. But I will say, Anya, I'm going to put a pin so we can actually have this conversation in 2 years, in 2022, for the 30th anniversary of Esther's book, Mayors and Money, so we can see what has happened with the economy and the recession and what has happened to cities. And that's really real. And so then I think, to go to Zachary's question, I think Biden's going to have to do something, I think, akin to like a WPA, to put not just artists to work, but like, how do we make sure we are targeting sort of Black folks who lost money from 2008 recession that just never came back and were never back on track. And I think he's starting with saying the coronavirus has affected Black Americans in a very specific way that it hasn't for other people. Hold on, there's someone at my door. So I'm going to pause that. And Alex, you answer that question or your question.
Sure. Yeah. Let me just start by saying too that I think as much as I have appreciated and taken solace from some of the optimism that Professor Greer and Professor Fuchs have offered, I guess I hate to be the Debbie Downer, but I am a little bit more skeptical both of the possibilities for the Republican Party to escape the sort of minoritarian, anti-small d Democratic grasp of Trump, and also for the possibilities of rebuilding Democratic power across the states and political institutions. And that's in part because Democrats had a pretty catastrophic showing at the state level. That's receiving less attention than the presidency and the Senate, but I think it's equally important. Democrats really failed to flip a number of important state legislative chambers, which meant that basically the majority of both chambers and states remain in near Republican or Republican control. And that's important both because states control all of these levers that we've just discussed that are so essential, but also because this is a redistricting cycle year, which means that those chambers in many cases are going to get to draw the lines for the next decade, which are going to make the possibilities for regaining control of the House easier for Republicans and harder for Democrats to defend. But with that cheery note of pessimism about the future, let me talk a little bit about what I think Democrats can do to regain a foothold in the non-college educated population. And crucially here, like Professor Greer, I stress that this is not just whites, but non-whites as well. And I think the key question is, can they produce immediate, tangible economic gains on issues that are meaningful to this population, which are wages, healthcare, education. On wages, the minimum wage is incredibly popular. We saw that although Biden lost Florida by what now looks to be a fairly substantial margin, minimum wage ballot initiative did quite well, attracting support from many of the most Republican communities. Similarly, measures to boost worker voice and organization through labor unions, quite popular. On healthcare, I think there's a lot that could be done administratively in a Biden administration to provide jobs and address the coronavirus epidemic, for instance, by creating a national public health corps, just like the Peace Corps created under JFK. We could imagine a similar public health corps that would provide immediate relief across the country and could potentially form a jobs initiative that would employ people. And then last, I would say on the question of education, relieving the debt that so many young Americans hold from college could be a really important way of boosting the economy and providing relief to folks who most need it. So I just point to those as being some of the areas where I think a Biden administration could make important gains in the working class, white and non-white alike.
Thank you, Alex. I'll give a couple closing remarks and then close this session out because I know we're almost out of time, but thank you. We were really touched this summer on a call with the Prime Minister of New Zealand, who has said that every young, they had to do with a lot of people wanting to come back who are overseas. And they obviously had a big shutdown as well with COVID. And the Prime Minister said everybody under 30 has to be in school or working or volunteering or taking care of somebody. And when you think about the state that our cities are in right now and all the work that needs to be done, it's so frustrating that we can't have a better jobs program. There were a couple questions in the chat that are things I can answer, like this point about disinformation and what can Biden do. I think he's already come out and said that he wants to modify Section 230, which gives liability to the platforms for third-party content. I've also been very interested, I feel like as always, it's coming, people are trying to sort of shift the onus to the communication strategy, right? There's this fantasy that if Democrats could communicate better, people would vote for them and would understand how important it is to have Democrats in office. Now they can, protect the interests of the working people. But I think it's been very interesting this week just to see how Fox is now turning away from Trump. And I have to believe that as Trump loses power, he's going to lose a little bit of the amplification and the platforms space that he's been given before. I don't think, I think long term we have a huge problem, but I think in the next few weeks or months, that'll be significant. And I'm reminded again of Robert Paxton's book, Anatomy of Fascism, right? And how at different points in fascist movements, different sectors of society support the fascist leaders. So you have people glomming on at different moments. So I have to believe that we're going to see some of those opportunists peel away from Trumpism, I hope. So I will close it here. There's so much more that we could talk about. And just really huge thanks to Professor Fuchs, Professor Greer, Professor Hertel-Fernandez, the folks that put this together, for Yasmin Ergas for suggesting the panel, and all the people that came and asked such good questions. Email us individually if you want to continue the discussion, because there was a lot we couldn't get to today. Thank you so much to everybody and to Dean Janow.